Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. I am talking about Curse of the Dead Gods today, which is a new roguelike that has just landed on Nintendo Switch. I believe it is available now, if not very soon after you watch this video. I was all set to talk about how the game is far too similar to last year's Hades. Hades being an incredibly popular and well received game, I would not be surprised if it does inspire a lot of copycats down the track. And I had thought that Curse of the Dead Gods was one of those because they are so similar in so many ways. But then I checked the early access release dates for both Hades and this on Steam, and as it turns out, Hades' early access release only happened about 2 months before Curse of the Dead Gods landed on the platform. That being, Hades was late 2019, and then Curse of the Dead Gods landed on early access in February 2020. Now, I still think that these games are structurally very similar, and I do feel like they come from the same place, but I do accept that it was a coincidence that they are so similar to one another, and really both are just adaptations of a very particular type of action roguelike formula. With that being said, like I said, they are very similar to one another, and I do think comparisons between the two are relevant, especially since they released so close to one another, and Hades was one of the big hits of last year. This game will no doubt try to latch onto some of that popularity in terms of its marketing going forwards, so let's make that comparison, and I am going to use this video to talk about why I think that Curse of the Dead Gods is the slightly lesser game. Now, that's not by much, and my review on digitallydownloaded.net will be very positive overall because I think this is a very good game, and being slightly less than Hades as one of the hits of 2020 is still an excellent achievement in its own right, and the developers should be very proud of what they've come up with this game. But I do think that Curse of the Dead Gods is a good way to remind us of just how special Hades really is and how much it did to push the envelope forward. That this game is kind of just a game is really saying a lot about it. And the crux of it is this, really. Curse of the Dead Gods is a little heavier and slower than Hades. So where Hades had this beautiful, fast and flowing action combat system which required almost Twitch-like responses from the player and gave you a character that was as responsive as it needed to be to dart around the battlefield and really do what you needed to with that gameplay system, Curse of the Dead Gods, by comparison, is a far more demanding game on managing stamina and mastering the parry system and being quite responsive to what the enemy monsters and whatever are doing, and it has a heavier sense in its flow. It's more about being grounded and solid and responsive, like I said, than being active and moving around a lot. And it seems to have taken some cues from Dark Souls, in fact, in terms of how the combat flows. The thing is, I'm not entirely sure that works in the context of the roguelike. See, I think the big problem with this game is that you don't feel good playing Curse of the Dead Gods until you've really mastered it and spent a lot of time with the game. Until you've got the enemy attack patterns down to the point that you don't need to think about them to counter them, and until you're so familiar with the weapons that you're using that they become second nature to you, your time in Curse of the Dead Gods is going to be this really frustrating experience of knowing what you need to do, but watching your health whittle down because you're just not timing things right. The game is really demanding on the timings for counters, and it's really demanding in terms of you need to know exactly the kind of the range arcs of weapons and how quickly they swing and all that. You need to bring all of that together in order to be effectively able to fight the enemies. So you know what you need to do, but it takes a long time to learn the exact rhythms of the game. So where Hades, by comparison, has this twitch speed which makes you feel like success is really dependent on your skill level, and as you get better in terms of skill, you make further progress, and you're kind of encouraged to play along with the game on that basis. Curse of the Dead Gods is this experience where you know what you need to do, but you can't for a while. It becomes this learning grind, and the roguelike difficulty and the willingness of the game to punish and be punitive over even small mistakes makes it really not entertaining to play at the start. It's like learning maths problems. Sure, once you've learnt them, there's a kind of fulfillment in being able to apply them to things, but at least this is my experience anyway. I wasn't very good at maths. Learning those maths problems is just this frustrating feeling where you're beating your head against a wall. That's what you get with Curse of the Dead Gods. So the footage that you're seeing in this video comes from that initial experience. I've deliberately avoided recording video from later on because this is what people are going to see from their first experience with the game. And if you compare this to my video on Hades, you can see that this one feels and looks a bit clunkier and clumsier later on, and we'll talk about that soon. It does improve and it becomes much more seamless and flowing, and you start to realize where the appeal of Curse of the Dead Gods lies. But getting over this initial hump really kind of involves pushing through what you're seeing on the screen in front of you. At the start of the game, there are 3 different areas that you can explore, and I think that in itself is a mistake, as each area has different enemies to fight. So right at the start, you're trying to work through 3 different sets of enemies, and you're not comfortable at fighting any of them. It just kind of triples the length of the learning process with this game at the start. And at the same time, each time your character that dies, the starting equipment they have for the next run is also randomized, meaning that you can't actually get familiar with any of the weapons and get your way into the game through that system either. Later on, that becomes an asset because it forces you to be flexible with how you use your weapons, but getting to the point where you're comfortable enough with every different type of weapon you might have access to is again part of that learning grind that I've been talking about. And as you can see, I really struggled to properly time the counters in this footage, and as a result my character took a beating in pretty much every encounter. That meant that later on, once I got to the bosses, I was just in no position to be able to fight the bosses on any fair level. The War of Attrition had more or less claimed me by the time I got up to the bosses. And that is another contrast to Hades, where Hades, because I believe it is quite skill based in terms of progress, the second time I got up to that first boss I was able to defeat that boss and move on. And because Hades is a difficult game, I then had the learning curve all over again, but I was able to learn quite quickly because it was more skill based. With Curse of the Dead Gods, because it's kind of more knowledge and understanding based, it took me many attempts to get to those bosses and then beat them, and as a result the progress through the game felt slower and it was less rewarding as a result of that. And the thing is, you can't really blame the player for that. It's not really my fault that I took so long to defeat these bosses, because it wasn't a lack of skill. I knew what I needed to do, but I was really struggling to pull all the pieces together, because you can't expect players to understand things like timing of windows for attacks and so on, and how to counter those attacks from very minimal exposure to enemies. That's just a system that requires a lot of learning, and where a game like Dark Souls, for example, allows you to make that learning by repetition and turning death in those games into a core mechanic to making progress. With Death of the Old Gods, Curse of the Dead Gods, dying really much like a roguelike returns you to square one in a lot of instances. The progress is much more limited in terms of progress from death to death. So I did feel like the progression loop in Curse of the Dead Gods wasn't really matching up with what the game was asking me to do in terms of the learning process. And I feel like Hades is a much more naturalistic and better designed game for the roguelike genre than Curse of the Dead Gods. Now, with all of that said, and once again I will have a very positive review of this game on digitally downloaded .net, I do think it all gets better, and as you start to learn the game's systems, the feeling of Curse of the Dead Gods comes into it, and you start to understand where the vision of the developers really lies. Once you've memorized the behavior and the timing of these enemies, countering them is this hugely satisfying experience, because it is very well kind of animated. You do get this great amount of feedback from a successful counter, which feels good, and the reward for doing so is huge, because the enemy becomes weakened and quite easy to defeat if you counter them. So there's some real brutal weight and impact behind the combat once you are successfully countering enemies, more often than you're missing the counter opportunities. And progression also starts to feel more rewarding, and the game's many intricate systems, and it has a lot of them, starts providing the depth that at the start of the game is kind of overshadowed by the struggle of the moment-to-moment gameplay. The real meat of Curse of the Dead Gods is getting into its systems, and to do that you need to first be comfortable enough with the incidental play, the moment-to-moment play, to be able to just refocus your energies on those systems. Again, that takes a while. It just takes a long time to get into Curse of the Dead Gods. And I do feel like the developers took a huge risk in back-ending so much of the appeal of this game's experience I hope for people's sake that they stick with it if they give it a go, because once this game starts to sing, it is a very challenging and satisfying example of a fairly hardcore roguelike title. Anyhow, that is enough of this video. Thank you as always for watching, and please do check out digitallydownloaded.net for my more coherent thoughts about the game. Please do let me know your own thoughts as you've been playing it. I'll be especially interested to hear how other people think that Curse of the Dead Gods and Hades compare to one another, because again, I do think they are very similar in their style, and I think that people will make that comparison, so I'll be keen to know what others think. Otherwise, please do click that like and subscribe button, that way you won't miss a video as I upload them. And if you are feeling generous, please do consider backing me on Patreon. Even $1 a month will go a long way to helping me to build this channel further and finding new and more interesting things to do with it. So your support is most generous and most appreciated. Anyway, thank you very much as always for watching again. Hope you have a good week, play lots of games, and we will see you at the next video.